Welcome to the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills we need to build healthy relationships with others. Today we're going to do a second part series on the topic of Alzheimer's. Specifically, we're going to talk about a caregiver and what are some of the concerns that we have for the caregiver in a situation like this.
And to provide us extra information on this topic, we are pleased to welcome back Anna Lang and Katie Fredette, who are professionals who have worked with Alzheimer's patients and families for years to help us get through this. So this is so important. We worry about what our declining years will look like, and this is certainly a prevalent condition that some people, we're living longer. And so this is something that afflicts a lot of families. I know that I worry about it. And we talked in our last episode about some of the strategies that care providers could use to validate and help support folks, our family members. But as we were going through it, I imagine there's a lot of stress and burnout. And today we're going to talk about that and how we could build capacity and resilience in ourselves as we try to engage with as much knowledge and empathy and patience as possible, right?
So maybe we could start out with, what are some of the most common statements that you hear or concerns from caregivers? Do they even talk about it? I mean, do you find that there's a hesitancy to even share with other people what they're going through for fear that they will be judged or in some way for even feeling those things? What kind of reaction are you seeing?
There's a lot of feelings. It's almost like going through bereavement.
Yeah.
Because you're going from being either someone's spouse to being, their caregiver. It's like a role reversal almost.
It's a tough transition.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're going to feel all kinds of emotions. You're going to feel frustration. You're going to feel sadness. You're going to feel like loss.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, wondering, how am I going to do all this? How can I do this?
Yeah, if we just revisit those stages of grief for a minute, if you're traveling linearly, and it's not a linear thing anyway, but like first you're in denial,
right.
And then you're angry, and then you kind of go through this bargaining of, well, maybe it doesn't have to happen, maybe there's a way, maybe it isn't Alzheimer's and it's something else, and then sadness and depression, and then finally acceptance. So
I'm thinking too of one that you don't normally think of in that string of emotions, but guilt, in the sense of, why am I feeling this way, or I'm so angry, or I wish that person were dead, these things that might come up in their thinking, and then feeling guilty for it, so that I would think it almost becomes cyclical. Is that a fair sort of rendition of what you experience?
That is very fair, yeah. That does happen. Sometimes people they see how much their significant other has gone downhill, and they want it to stop for them. Mm-hmm. And when it finally does stop, it's like, oh my gosh. And then sometimes when it does happen and they do pass, then you feel empty because you spent all your time taking care of this person or trying to take care of them, and it's what do you do with yourself then? Mm-hmm. And then you go through that whole stage again of the bereavement, going through that again.
Right. I mean, do they even have time to grieve? That you said the initial, when they understand what's going to happen, that sense of loss of a partner, say, and a spouse. And do they have time to grieve before they get right into the caregiving role? Again, depending on how fast the disease progresses.
Exactly.
I think time is an issue just in even the care. How is there respite? How do they have an identity beyond just the care provider? Or what suggestions do you have for encouraging folks to preserve that identity as somebody who's other than just the care provider? I know as a nurse you probably have to do that too, separate your giving and your empathy from I need to give to me too. How do you do that?
Well, what I have found is, and we teach people this too, you have to take care of yourself first. If you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be much of a caregiver for the person. You find a way to continue to do the things that you've always liked, whether it's go golfing for a Saturday afternoon if you're the husband, go belong to different groups that you have the interest in still. And then there is people out there that will come sit for a couple hours, or you can build your community, I think is what I like to call it.
Build your community. And so who should be in your community?
Well, community members, first of all, I always would say family members that are showing an interest, or maybe they're not and they're just not sure how to be that. They'll say, oh, I can't do anything like that. And we're like, well, you don't have to do a whole lot when you're here. Just the normal. Sometimes you just go and you sit and you listen to music with them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you're, depending on how long you want to get away for, sometimes it's just making a snack for the person if they're, in the beginning stages. And I think some people are afraid of the personal care portion of it. And so we try to always encourage
the physical aspect of it.
Yeah.
What type of things should I, when you say care for yourself, what type of things should I be watching out for myself, that maybe these are indicators that I'm not paying enough attention to my own needs in this situation?
Exhaustion, feeling tired, crying. That's, like Katie said, that's why it's important to take care of yourself. You have to remember your hobbies, the things that bring you joy, and trying to balance that. So when your loved one is sleeping, maybe you take a nap, or you do something for yourself. You take advantage of other family members, meaning have them come in and help, or sit there, even if it's just for you to just take a shower or a quick nap, or to go for a walk outside. Deep breathing, taking a deep breath, knowing that, some days are going to be harder than others, and whatever little success that you have with dealing with your loved one, even if it's just getting them to take a shower that day, understanding that is a success. Finding ways to appreciate the little things that happen, and understanding that things are going to change. And not all those changes have to be bad. It's finding another way to connect with your person, and accepting that and finding that joy, and kind of going from there.
Do you find that I'm trying to imagine someone like you working with a caregiver, and I'm sure that they would begin to feel all of those things that you described. So do you almost have them chart things and saying, you're going to feel all these things, but when it reaches the point where it's 80% of your time you're feeling this way and everything, do you break it down that way for them to say, this is an indicator that you need to take different action?
I think when you are talking to a caregiver, husband, wife, brother, sister, whoever it is, that's the main. There's usually always one main caregiver. When you're talking to that person, it's trying to, like I said earlier, building that community. So if you're feeling any of those feelings, if you're not wanting to get out of bed in the morning for yourself because you know what lies ahead of you, or you don't know what lies ahead of you, truly, it's a matter of, all right, pull your resources in and say, there's more than just family members. There's support groups. Sometimes it's a matter of going to a support group. I don't know if they're once a week, once a month. I can't remember what they are locally, but and they have great ideas. Sometimes somebody else has lived through the same thing that you have lived through, and say they have a better solution. That's what it's all about.
So instead of having to reinvent it with each patient, you can share information.
Absolutely.
When we talked about the denial as part of grieving, I'm wondering, again, I'm trying to put myself in a situation like this. Do you find that caregivers go through quite a time of denial, in the sense not of what's happening to them, but more of the impact it's having on them? Are they denying this until it gets to almost a crisis stage? Do you find that happening? Or are they pretty much aware of the progression and saying, I've reached the point now where I need to do something else? Is denial a problem for caregivers in that regard?
I don't know if I would call it denial. That maybe it's denial that you want to feel like you're doing as much as you can possibly
Right, that
do.
you're on top of it. Yeah.
Right, and you feel like I should be able to do this.
Yes, the
you know?
should. That's what I was wondering. The should statements, are they coming in, for a lot of the caregivers?
I would think that it would be hard to really let go of what the relationship had been, because this is a one-way trip. You can arrest it and you can slow it, but you can't reverse it, right? And so just from my own perspective, if I were the patient or even the care provider, I would be really reluctant to want to embrace the truth initially.
Yeah.
Because it kind of blots out what was before.
I'm thinking too of almost the flip side of that too, that if my marriage hasn't been a very productive one, and now I'm in a role now, I have to be a caregiver for someone that I really didn't see that much as the kind of spouse I really wanted to have.
Or a parent,
So-
if you've had a complicated relationship with a parent.
Right.
That
So you're carrying an old feelings from a relationship that was intact, and now into a caregiving type of thing. What does that do to the caregiver when it's sort of a double whammy, of perhaps grieving a relationship that wasn't what he or she wanted, and now they're a caregiver for this person too? Do you find something like that happening? Or is that rare?
No, I have seen that before. And the key for that is them sharing that with their resources. So with other family members, with the provider that's involved, finding respite, finding other ways to help take care of that person while you deal with your own internal struggles. Because as we've already reiterated, you can't take care of somebody if you can't take care of yourself.
Right.
And that is going to be key, or else you're going to be very, very frustrated. And that's just going to kind of make things a little worse if you don't address that.
Are there therapists, or do you advocate finding a therapist for a caregiver? Because when you talk about sharing that kind of thing, I would imagine as a caregiver, I might be reluctant to share my feelings about what my marriage was like to other family members, and now on top of this. So is it common for caregivers to go for therapy as part of this process?
I have seen caregivers, when they're just feeling like they're so overwhelmed, and we have suggested that to people.
Okay.
Maybe instead of a group setting or a family member, maybe they need somebody who's just for them. For them, they can
And
sit
safe for them,
and
right?
safe, and they can say whatever they want to them. Their feelings of guilt, their feeling, this is what's going on in my life, and how can I deal with this? And it just, yes, we have recommended therapists for them.
I would imagine that the family dynamics that have been in play for years and years and years, even with siblings.
Yes.
If you're taking care of a parent, that could also play out in terms of not being, you say build your community, build your resources, but sometimes that isn't unified, right?
Absolutely.
Can you talk about what happens in that case?
Some people, family members, are more involved than others, and I think you find that with any whether it be dementia, Alzheimer's, or cancer, anything like that. You know your limits, they know their limits, and you just have to step back and say, okay, I understand they're not able to do anything to help physically or be here, but you know what? There's still other things they can do to help. If they have a little bit of interest, you've got to be able to put it out there to them and say, I'm okay with you not being able to come sit with mom for 2 hours. Could you please pick us up groceries? Or there's
Creative about it.
Yes.
Is this a case when an advance directive and power of attorney and things would help the tension, or does that not make a difference? Like, then you're not fighting because somebody has been designated in advance to
Or
make
even
these
at
decisions.
what point do you do that? So, while the person with Alzheimer's still has some capability?
Well, I would imagine you can't do it
Afterward,
when
yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah.
So have you run about, what is your advice around that? I mean, I know that's not in your toolbox, but I'm sure you have seen it peripherally.
It's definitely helpful. Like, everybody should think about having an advance directive, absolutely, because it's your wishes on paper in case you are incapacitated for whatever reason, cognitively, physically, can't speak. So somebody knows what you want. It's your voice on a piece of paper about what you would like for your health care. And for whether you want feeding tubes, whether you want antibiotics, what kind of care do you want, even afterwards, even after you pass, your wishes on what you would like. Personally, I found that very helpful when it came to my parents because I knew for sure it was what they wanted. I didn't have to guess because you're grieving, you're hurting. And you add that on top of it, it's helpful to know what somebody wants and you can follow through and know that you did the right thing.
Right, yeah.
So I do think
Reassurance.
that, but you have to do that before there's any cognitive issues.
It's probably
Yeah.
not legal
Curious
otherwise.
too about, we've talked about the strain or the stress for a caregiver in terms of a spouse. But what about nurses and people who are working with them? Do you find that the people who care for patients who are with Alzheimer's have a different type of stress requirement or tolerance than nursing other types of situations?
I do believe they do.
Okay.
Their threshold is nurses' aides who are dealing on a daily basis. Somebody in a nursing facility, if they're on one of the units that deals with dementia 24 hours a day, they have most of those caregivers, if they're in it for the right reason, have a higher threshold.
Okay.
And the nice part I have found over the years is they have each other to talk to about things such and such as driving me crazy, can somebody else go in? And it's very much a give and take like that when you're working with, say, 5 other caregivers, and even though you probably have 30 residents you're caring for, sometimes you need to back away if you're nearing your threshold
Right.
and saying, can you come? This is where I'm at right now.
And hopefully that community that you talked about would be part of an institution, that they would provide that for their staff, knowing that they're
We hope,
dealing with it.
Yes.
That leads to a question I have too about if I'm a caregiver and I'm reaching the point where I need to place the family member, what should I be looking for in terms of institutions?
That's where you really need to understand the disease process and what is happening. When you're looking at a facility, obviously it's really hard to place right now because places are very full and there's not a lot of staff. But you want to know, what do you do? What do you do with my loved one during the day? How do you deal with behaviors? How do you deal with sundowning? You want to ask specific questions so you know what is going to happen to your spouse while they're in that facility. Keeping them busy is huge, to keep them awake during the day as much as possible with little breaks of rest, so they sleep at night, because their internal clock kind of reverses a little bit, and they're up at night and they want to sleep during the day. So those kind of questions are what you're going to want to ask, because you're going to want to know what's happening. How do they deal with that? How do they deal with behaviors that they see? Those are super important questions to ask.
Just returning to the physicality of it, because we've said it's important to look through the lens of dementia or Alzheimer's to know that the person isn't doing it on purpose. It's part of, it's a response. So what's happening to the brain as somebody declines with Alzheimer's?
Well, what happens is the matter in their brain is deteriorating. Depending on the progression of it, you can look at somebody's brain when you or I are going in for an
Maybe
MRI.
stick with you.
Oh,
Getting a little too close here.
and you can see it's a fully intact, all the matters there, and then somebody comparing it to somebody who's been 5 years into the dementia Alzheimer's
And it
stage.
can be that long. It can
Absolutely
be. Or
can be.
longer.
Yes, I've seen it at least. I've seen it up to 10 years. But looking at that, and you can physically see the deterioration and know, okay, that's a better understanding. I'm like, they can't process, they can't think the way that we do, because they don't have the capacity in there anymore.
They cannot. They're
The neural
not doing
pathways
this.
aren't there. Yeah.
Their brain is literally dying.
Yeah.
And they're not doing it on purpose. They're not forgetting, or they're not being belligerent on purpose.
No.
Because we tend to remember what they were and expect, have
Their personality,
maybe
what it was. Yeah.
miscalibrated expectations about it. But it really is something that may look like a cognitive thing, but it becomes a very physical thing as well.
In connection with that, does Alzheimer have a pattern where it tends to attack certain parts of the brain, or can that be just random, where it starts to degenerate?
It depends on the type of dementia, on what part of the brain it affects.
Okay.
What can you do on your shift if you're having a moment? And what could a family member do, like in the moment, to calibrate or regulate themselves?
Well, and this goes for everybody also. If you're having a moment stress-wise and need to back yourself out of the situation, you take yourself out before.
But if you're the only one there and you need to provide care, what can I do? What do I need to remember?
You need to remember that, first of all, back yourself out. I still say that, only because make sure they are safe. That's the biggest thing. Make sure they're safe. If you can't deal with their situation at the moment, take a deep breath. Do some deep breathing exercises.
Breath.
Absolutely. Do some what we call grounding techniques. Okay.
What are those?
Grounding techniques. You're home, you touch something, it's like people, I've seen it all over, everywhere now. Take your shoes and your socks off. Grounding is coming to be like with the earth, not in the winter time,
But just connecting with energy.
yes. It might be a salt lamp. It might be just something that brings you back to some peace in your life. And that seems to help people. Maybe you need to take 5 minutes out and go read a few pages in a book. Maybe it's religion that brings you back. Maybe you need to say a prayer and ask for help, and
Go see some trees.
anything. Practicing gratitude. What am I thankful for? Because I'm thankful this person that I've loved for so long is still physically here with me. And I mean, you're not alone. You're still with that person. And to say, oh, I'm so glad they're here with me, makes a difference. It really makes a big difference. And they're not completely the same anymore, but you're not alone. That person is still physically there with you. Because as we all know, when somebody does pass away, that's a whole new feeling of, it's a different type of emptiness.
Finality,
Yeah.
yeah.
What about pharmaceuticals for dealing with Alzheimer's? Do they use drugs to pacify, to have mood regulation?
Are you talking about the care provider or the patient?
Yeah, I have thought about that.
Sometimes it
Maybe
is
that's a
both.
twofold question. I was thinking, I guess, in terms of the patient, but it could be for, it could be for the provider as well.
Sometimes they need both, but the key is to try not to use those if you don't have to. And it's understanding that if you're seeing what they label as a behavior, it's normally an unmet need that they have that they're trying to let you know about.
To figure out what the need is, and again, like the
Exactly.
label that we were talking about in the last episode, don't call it something, but figure out the need. Huh.
But there are physiological and neurological processes going on that could cause behavior, right? That would have nothing to do with
Absolutely.
the usual needs we think about.
And that's as you look at the behaviors you're seeing in trial and error. If somebody's help me, reaching out all the time, and you can't physically see that they're hungry, and they hadn't had an accident, things like that. Making sure that those basic needs that we all have are met, and that's still happening, or they're getting violent, and you know that they're not hungry. You know that they had just been changed. You know that they've had the stimulation. Then you slowly have to start looking at the pharmaceutical aspect, but you got to be careful, and you've got to start at the smallest dose and obviously work your way up.
I would think that would be an advantage for, say, a spouse or a son or daughter to have that familiarity with a person, what they were like before they were experiencing Alzheimer's, to be able to read, is this a need or is this something that's happening over which they have no control?
Yeah.
Well, it is a big topic, and I'm glad that we're talking about it, because as we live longer and maybe in a more toxic environment, and this is a part of our world, and we thank you, Anna,
Yes,
thank you, Katie, for coming and maybe normalizing this conversation so that we could have it with our family, the people that we love, and our community. And there are places that we can reach out to. There are agencies, there are nonprofits, and there may be groups that we could tap into. But it's important to kind of recalibrate ourselves in order to still love and care for the people in our lives and ourselves always as well. We thank you so much for being with us on the Relationship Toolbox, and we hope that you'll return again soon.